disappear here for a second. Clears up. Sound good? Okay.
So, I'm going to use something new. Moment of spontaneity, or a few hours of spontaneity, and I'll probably talk rather freely from this manuscript. What I say may not resemble the manuscript very closely. But first, I better check back and see what sort of record is there. If it sounds all right, I'll go ahead. Otherwise, I'll have to go back to the words and start over again. No, that didn't sound too bad. That's a good, didn't it? So, soon, but it will. So as to what I with psychology. Psycho. Because I was apprehensive about a certain proved to be one that did happen. Expect. Graduate majoring in mathematics. Students were in those days, as they and still claim to be right here. I was very much afraid that I might have to teach for a year or two before I continued the career I had planned for myself. That was the misfortune I foresaw. I was afraid I was going to have to teach. If anyone had told me then that I would still be teaching after all these years, I probably would have been deeply depressed. In order to teach, one had to have a certificate, and in order to get a certificate in those days, just as you know, you had to do a lot of silly things. One of them was to take the elementary course in psychology, a notion that otherwise would never have occurred to me. As I look back on it, I still would not want to take that course. In fact, I don't think I've ever seen the beginning course in psychology. I would encourage those when students come to me and say they're so intrigued. So, see something. So I better interrupt this narrative long enough to tell you something of what I plan to say. This is the autobiography of a certain theory in psychology, known as the psychology of personal constructs. This is one case in which I feel myself uniquely qualified to write this account, because I wrote the theory also. Now, I realize that writing a theory does not necessarily mean you know how you came by it. Undoubtedly, what I wrote was hopelessly entangled in the ideas of my predecessors. Howsoever that may be, I can at least write about what I now recall. Rather than starting with the basic premises of personal construct theory, the usual strategy for making a theory respectable, I'd like to mention certain events and tentative conclusions reached and abandoned along the way to its formulation. This is not to say that the events shaped the theory, not that at all. But what I have to describe are the happenings out of which, in some unaccountable way, theory has sought to make some kind of sense. But now, here we are, only a few sentences deep in this discussion, and already I'm in a sort of difficulty. I wanted to relate events rather than premises, but already I've let slip the premise that it was not the events that shaped the theory, and that the theory was rather a device contrived to cope with the events. But how can one say what he has to say, or mention things that have happened, or even select things he might mention, without in some degree exposing his premises? You can't, Benny. Well, if you agree, that's fine. Well, now I've departed from my intention a second time, for what I've asked you to accept is itself a premise, a second one. Two premises, one to explain the other. First, it was not the events that shaped the theory, it was I. And two, the notion that a premise is itself that vantage point, whatever it may be, from which an observation is made. This is to say that you can't blame this theory on circumstances, and even if you could, the circumstances would not be recognizable without some presumptive basis for identifying them. Well, now that you all know what the theory is about, there isn't likely to be much suspense in the story I have to tell. In this first course in psychology that I took, I sat on the back row of a very large class, tilted my chair against the wall, made myself as comfortable as possible, and kept one ear cocked for anything interesting that might turn up. One day, the professor, a very nice guy who seemed to be trying hard to convince himself that psychology was something to be taken seriously, turned to the blackboard and wrote an S, an O, and an R. Thereupon I straightened up my chair and listened, thinking to myself that now, after 2 or 3 weeks of preliminaries, we might be getting to the meat of the matter. I listened intently to sessions, at least I think I did. Was that the S was what you had to have. Was put there so the poor S would have something to account for. I never did find out what that arrow stood for, not to this day, and I've pretty well given up trying to figure it out. I can see, of course, that once you step into this little solipsism, you can go round and round with publication after publication without being obligated to come out with anything particularly useful. But it has never been very clear to me why you should have to step onto this particular merry-go-round in the first place, unless you are one of those peculiar people who like first courses in psychology, where such things are talked about, and are so fed up with all the other things in this world that you're willing to sign up as a psychologist for the duration. Some of my friends have tried to explain to me that the world is filled with S's and R's, and it is unrealistic of me to refuse to recognize these things. But before they've talked themselves out, they become pretty vague about which is which. There are others, who are not so concretistic, who argue that the formula represents only a relationship between events, and not the events themselves. And this makes a little more sense. And it might continue to make sense if they didn't persist in talking about the matter, rubbing their forefingers across that arrow in the formula. They always do that. Now that gets me all confused again, for they seem to be contradicting themselves and saying that it is the arrow that represents the relationships between the events, not the S and the R. Well, there may be some sense in it, but I don't see. Anyway, out of all this, I've gradually developed the notion that psychology is pretty much confined to the paradigms it implies. And while you can take off in a great many directions and travel a considerable distance in one of them, as indeed we have with stimulus response psychology, there's no harm in consorting with a strange paradigm now and then. Indeed, the notion has occurred to me that psychology may best be regarded as a collection of paradigms viewed by ex-physicists, ex-physiologists, and ex-preachers, as well as a lot of other intellectual renegades. Even more recently, it has struck me that this is the nature of man. He is an embedded collector of paradigms. But now I'm getting ahead of myself again. Well, about 3 years later, after I had abandoned engineering as a career and had entered graduate school in an effort to learn something about sociology and labor relations, I decided it was high time I had a look at Freud. I can remember the occasion rather well. I was in the northeast corner of the reading room of the library at the University of Kansas. I don't remember which one of Freud's books I was trying to read, but I do remember the mounting feeling of incredibility that anyone could write such nonsense, much less publish it. It was not the pansexualism that makes Freud objectionable to some new readers, but the elastic meanings and arbitrary syntax that disturbed me. If I had any misgivings about having abandoned psychology so readily after my first encounters, I had very few regrets after reading Freud that day. But this is not the end of the story, as I'm sure some of you know. It might have been the end of the story if what psychologists say about learning and sociologists say about some cultures were true. What happened was that about 4 years later, Dean Seashore, locally known as the Iron Dean, in person conferred on me the PhD in psychology, practicing his part of the ceremonies, as he was planning to do, with a little speech about the Doctor of Philosophy degree being the highest that any university could bestow. He did this for the benefit of the people who were getting their Doctor of Medicine degrees and who were required to sit down with the ordinary graduates while we were on the platform. Anyway, he alleged that part of this transitional period between Freud and Seashore are not particularly relevant to this discussion, except possibly the fact that during the interval, I had taught soapbox oratory in the Labor College for labor organizers, government, and an Americanization Institute for prospective citizens, public speaking for the American Bankers Association, and dramatics in the junior college. But I had also taken a master's degree with the study of workers' use of leisure time and an advanced professional degree in education of all things at the University of Edinburgh. And that I had dabbled academically in education, sociology, economics, labor relations, biometrics, speech pathology, and cultural anthropology. And I had majored in psychology for a grand total of 9 months. This I might say in case any of you are wondering. That had anything to do with it. We recently established. They only barely institutions, and there were many without public education should be abandoned altogether, at least for the duration of the Depression. It is a time for a teacher to talk of sure. It's not a time. I could have used the same circumstances to confirm stimulus response psychology. It is to say, rather, that the premises with which I entered the situation no longer were useful to me. Or perhaps it would be more correct to say that it was the actions that derived from my premises that did not seem to. I still liked to pursue some exciting answers I had about physiological psychology, in particular something which I turned up to aphasia. With engineering, I've always found the drafting board an instrument of relaxation. This was about psychology. So why did I at this point turn from the things I spontaneously enjoyed to the heart-breaking tasks of the psychotherapist? Was it the circumstances? I think not. It was I. Was it an inner sense of duty to fellow man? Well, if you mean by that that there was something called duty that intruded itself into my life and beckoned me to follow it, then the answer is definitely no. Nothing like that ever happened. As a matter of fact, when someone tries to tell me what my duty is, I'm not likely to take it very seriously. For it seems to me he is probably a busybody who, having failed to make something out of his own circumstances, wants me to fulfill his neglected aspirations. In other words, I do not regard my career in psychology as a calling. If you want to think about it, everything around this cause, if we choose to heed. Moreover, I have never been completely satisfied that becoming a psychologist was even a very good idea in the first place, a doubt that I'm sure some of my colleagues share. The only thing that seems clear about my career in psychology is that it was I who got himself into it, and I who have pursued it. But again, I'm ahead of myself, for this is part of the third, whose autobiography I'm reciting. It was somewhere around this point in my experience that it occurred to me that what seemed true of myself was probably no less true of others. If I initiated my actions, so did they. I suppose you might say that this position limits me to a psychology of man rather than of his circumstances. It is a psychology concerned with what we do and why we do it, rather than one that attempts to pinpoint the events that compel others to do what they do not choose to do. There is, I suspect, a lot of difference between these two psychologies. But so far, it must be said, there is nothing in my thinking that could be called a full-blown theory of personality. Only a kind of a convenient posture, I assume, toward that confronted me. But to believe that the man is the author of his destiny is not to deny that he may be tragically limited by his circumstances. I saw too many unfortunate youngsters, some of them literally starving in the depression-ridden dust bowl, for me not to be aware of their tragic limitations. Clearly, there are many things they might have liked to do that circumstances would not permit. But, nevertheless, even this is not to say that they were victims of circumstances. However much they always denied them, there was still an infinity of possibilities open to them. The task was to generate the imagination needed to envision these possibilities. And this is a point of departure for psychology of man. The canons of 19th century scientific determinism notwithstanding. So, I listened to people in trouble and I tried to help them figure out what they could do about it. None of the things I had studied or pursued in the years before seemed to have any very specific bearing on what confronted us. Though at one time or another, through this period, I probably attempted to make some use of everything I knew. Much more than the referral. It has to be played in metropolitan areas where there is a suitable proliferation of agencies and specialists on whom you can unload your less profitable clients. In western Kansas, when the person came to me, we were pretty much stuck with each other. Our job was to figure out what the two of us could do ourselves. Now that I look back on it, this was an open invitation to approach psychology from an unconventional angle. And that is what I'm afraid I did. The strangest thing about this period is that I went back to Freud for a second look. My recollections of Rasmussen's principal nervous pathways and of Thorndike's electrical condenser theory of learning applied to the synapses have not proved very helpful to people troubled about what was to become of them. But now that I have listened to the language of distress, Freud's writings made a new kind of sense. And that fellow Freud, who was indeed a clinician, he too must have listened to these same cries echoing from deep down where there are no sentences, no words, and no syntax. So it was that I became, quote, a Freudian, if not by training, at least by persuasion. The Freudian language of explanation provided me with a way of understanding the difficulties of those who came to me for aid, of anticipating their thoughts and of having them gain initiative in their lives. In short, I began to have what I thought was insight. Through my Freudian interpretations, judiciously offered at those moments when clients seemed ready for them, a good many unfortunate persons seemed to be profoundly helped. I suppose it is clear that none of this was under psychiatric supervision, nor under any other kind of supervision for that matter. My clients and I, as I've said, were on our own. Well, I think I have come a long way since this period in my psychological career. We, my client and I, are still pretty much on our own whenever we buckle down to a difficult problem. It is important this be understood in order to envision what came next. Now, there is something about the obvious things in this world that repeatedly rises to plague me. I know that many persons complain that they are tormented by the uncertainties of life, by its ambiguities, or by the fact that there seem to be no final answers. I think I know how they feel, and to some extent I am troubled by such things too. Though thus far I have no very serious complaints about my uncertainties. But those things I once thought I knew for sure, those are what get me into hot water, time after time. They are a lot more troublesome than those things I've known all along that I didn't understand. Moreover, a world jam-packed with lead-pipe certainties, dictionary definitions, and doomsday finalities strikes me as a pretty gloomy place. How can there be any room in a world like that for such a nascent thing as life? I suppose it would have to be conceded But life in the opposite kind of a world of chaos, might seem pretty hopeless after a while, too. But, as between the two, a world without hopes or a world without doubts, I think for myself I would prefer the world without hopes. Of course, I'd prefer some of both, to have some hopes as well as some doubts. But still, if I had to end my life on some final note, I think I'd like it to be a question, preferably a basic one, well posed and challenging and beckoning beyond where only others after me might go, rather than a terminal conclusion, no matter how well documented. There is something exciting about a question, even one you have no reasonable expectation of answering. But a final conclusion, that is like the stroke of doom. After it, nothing. Nothing at all. It was with some such thoughts as these in the back of my noggin that I began to be uncomfortable with my Freudian insights. It was not that they were failing me so much as it was that I felt myself beginning to take them for granted. And ideas, like women, when too long taken for granted, are likely to turn fickle. So I began fabricating insights. Some of them were about as un-Freudian as I could make them. First proposed somewhat cautiously, of course, and then as I began to see what was happening, more boldly. My only criterion was that the explanation account for the crucial facts as the client saw them, and that it carry implications for approaching the future in a different way. Well, now you can see what it meant for them not to be under supervision during this period. Now what happened? Well, many of the preposterous explanations worked, some of them surprisingly well. To be sure, the wilder ones fell flat, but a re-examination of the interview often suggests where the client's difficulty with them had lain. Now, I would not want to say that as a general rule, my fabricated insights worked as well as my Freudian ones, but I can say that some of them outperformed normal expectations. Well, perhaps I should add that I have some doubts that this experiment could reasonably be repeated. In Western Freudianisms in the past year. Psychologist. The psychology try to make something out of it. Nowadays, of course, clients have a lot of preconceived sophistries about what has to happen in psychotherapy. Notions about authority relationships, sexual potency, mother fixation, etc. And besides, they expect a detailed accounting for all the frustrations of childhood they can remember, as well as all the daily household episodes they can cram into their therapeutic hour. They want their autobiographies thoroughly psychologized and preferably Freudianized if they can afford a little higher fee, and they want kept up to date. Before I go too far with this account, I'd like to make it clear that I do not think the psychologist has the right to exploit his clients. There's a difference between exploitation and doing something unconventional in psychotherapy. Two considerations underlie this difference. First, the client has to be a participant in the experimental venture. He should himself be looking for new solutions emerging out of the experience and just as ready as the therapist to accept disconfirming evidence. What is proposed to him as an interpretation should always be in the form of a hypothesis, not in the form of a natural truth exempt from any human appraisal. In other words, it should be clear that the psychologist is his fellow experimenter, not an anxious priest. Second, both of them should keep themselves, moment by moment, as sensitive as possible to let emerges from the undertaking. No waiting for 50 cases to accumulate before concluding that your method has brought half of them to the brink of suicide. There's something else, too. The therapist should do his best to prepare himself for the kind of responsibility he carries. This, as you can now readily see, means training himself as a scientist, not merely as a practitioner. It seems to me that the extensive training of therapists in theory and technique only, and failing to demonstrate scientific methodology as an actual interview procedure, is itself unethical. Only as the therapist approaches his client's problem as a scientist and invites his client to do the same, to a limit of his ability, can he avoid the tyranny of dogmatism and the professional exploitation of his clients. In other words, I think what I did was less exploitative than what is commonly done under much more conventional control. It is much more feasible to get this kind of training, this scientific kind of training now than it was 30 years ago, although a lot of the most prestigeful preparations today seem to me to unfit the therapist for joining his client in the truly sensitive and humble exploration of the world. Too often the training substitutes doctrine for inquiry. It makes the therapist feel respectable rather than responsible. There's a lot of difference between the two. As a result of this exploration of preposterous explanations, I developed the notion that what many clients needed was something they could use to give them a fresh approach to life, some explanation they could employ to cover a rather large number of future contingencies. While it might be helpful if the new constructions of events covered the original complaints, I was not at all sure that this was essential. And when I say that what is needed is something to facilitate the composed anticipation of contingent events, I'd like it to be clear that I refer to internal events, such as those we commonly call feelings, as well as to external events. About this possibility of ignoring the original complaints, I reached this hypothesis more or less by accident. It came about in this way. After a time, the requests for psychological help exceeded my spare hours. This was not particularly surprising. So it was that often, after listening to a person describe his difficulties, I had to explain to him that it would be months before I could see him. It occurred to me that if I had some responsibility to suggest some things, that I did have responsibility to suggest some things. Things we might do while waiting his time. Sometimes this took the form of reminding him that there were others in distress too, and there were certain kinds of things that anyone might do to be helpful. This was not intended to cure him, but it was merely something that needed to be done, and he might as well make himself useful while waiting to see me. Besides, his contribution would be a measure of how much he wanted help from himself. I might add at this point that I charged no fee. In fact, after more than 30 years, I have still to collect my first fee for psychotherapeutic services. They had come to realize that other persons they knew needed it. They were willing to wait a few weeks longer. So, problem in a new perspective. So much that there have been experience. They live them, seeing. This kind of statement was often about what you get from so-called successfully treated clients. That is to say, troubles still with them, no longer unmanageable, however. And yet, this kind of statement actually suggests a better prognosis than the euphoric claims that some clients make in their favorite rights and their health. All this means that my clients, whose treatment had been postponed and who made themselves useful in the meantime, were actually paralyzed by their altruistic efforts. It's a question I'm not prepared to answer. It may not even be a very good question. What the experience does suggest is that the new structure that emerges from psychotherapy may not need to cover the old complaints. May not need to cover them at all. Indeed, psychotherapy may not need even to deal with that elusive entity called the self, regarded by so many of our colleagues as the focal point of their efforts. But there was something else that began to dawn on me at this time, where I did not attempt to put it into words until years later. It is the notion that one does not have to disprove one proposition before entertaining one of its alternatives. A lot of hopeless controversy between scientists could be avoided if this possibility were explored. Each of them could go about his business without distraction, long enough to see what he could turn up on his own, without becoming embroiled in controversy with his colleagues. The same is probably true of all of us. One way of life need not be invalidated before the outcomes of another are examined. The profession in psychotherapy can free himself from the indicative needs of our language system long enough to entertain some other hypotheses about other ways of living. He can save himself and his therapist a lot of trouble becoming the so-called resistances and false premises of his previous outlook. Therapy could then become concerned with alternatives. Instead of involving the participants in a long, intricate, and reductionistic analysis designed to disabuse the client of his neurotic notions. Third step from which next idea in the sequence. Step. When it began to come out in the 1930s, seemed intriguing to me as well as to others, particularly what he had to say about psychodrama. But whereas psychodrama for him led back into classical personality theories implied in Greek drama, just as Freud's clinical experiences reminded him of classical films, I was led more further back into the development of the extemporaneous theater out of method acting in Europe after World War I. I suppose, too, in some way I may have been thinking about the James Lange theory of emotion. Takings might have as much to do with the development of his personality as did the imprint of the events with which he came in contact, or the insights he was able to conjure up with a couple of his therapist. To put it very simply, perhaps man was shaped by his commitments and what he did to fulfill them. Even a momentary commitment, experienced for no more than a fleeting instant during the psychotherapeutic interview. and bath was removed during the holiday. Might make a lifetime difference. There was nothing man over the history of society, but it said, for example, that the president did not make a man out of a politician, provided he commits himself to it. Professional control. Now, also make the man dedicated himself to professional objectives. More than one of us has assumed the role of scholarship by first undertaking the responsibility of teaching. And closely allied to the concepts of real commitment was something else that came to my attention in the late 1930s. Raised questions about the ways in which language and thought are interrelated, with ideas about general semantics, not only my own experiences in psychotherapy, but also what I thought I saw in psychodrama. Not only did it seem man uses with and hold the structure of his thoughts, the names by which he calls himself, the structure of his personality, with a particular kind of meaning that has been so for thousands of years. The man who knew himself as Saul became the man who imagined himself as Paul, perhaps in a way that it would have been impossible if he had persisted in identifying himself as Saul. Well, women whose marriages confronted them with particular difficulties in complementing their husbands' lives were greatly aided in the transition by the change in their names. I'd seen this happen in cases where I had some intimate knowledge of what the woman had to overcome. Moreover, those professions, which supposedly required the greatest sublimation of personal impulses, often made the task easier for their members by attaching some such title as Reverend or Doctor to the man's name. This bit of disidentification of the rest of humanity does not, of course, always work. It is not, I'm sure, that there is any special magic in names, only the magic that we invest in them. Behind the name is the identity that we put there. To the extent that we remain faithful to that identity we put there, we remain faithful to the name, and vice versa. If the identity is to be changed, it does, of course, require more than a mere change in name. But the change in name, along with all the other terms of one's identity, can have profound psychological implications. But now, where are we? We have seen persons change as a result of carrying out new commitments, and we change as a consequence of their redefinitions of themselves. As enlightening as these glimpses of what a viable psychology of man might be, it still seems as if the objective eludes our grasp. How often the client in psychotherapy says, in effect, I see what I want to do. I see now how to do it and where. And I see how someone like me could step out into an entirely new way of life. But I cannot picture myself, me, ever becoming anything other than what I am. It only seems enough to say that such adequate to argue that his thoughts are behavior. There must be action to make the man. Though I doubt that very many psychologists do it this way. And so this particular venture that started with the S, the R, and the R in the classroom blackboard continued to blunder on its way without, I'm afraid, any very respectable identification with the mainstream of American psychology. But howsoever thoughts may fail to progress, One's circumstances move ahead without waiting for them. So it was with me. With the unsolicited help of some legislators in western Kansas and the gratuitous application of the state's most prominent secretary, these clinics were sponsored by schools. Which, while their characteristics are somewhat difficult to cooperate, did have a certain appreciation of the personal distress of a family. Features of this statewide experience was the opportunity to examine the language of complaints used by teachers, parents, children, and others. Each to others, or to the person complained about. Teachers don't understand how their pupils feel. Shoes of a parent. A child. The disruption did not necessarily state the issue or provide adequate grounds for approaching the person complained about.
Side of the tape. Was it understandable at all? Oh, okay. Okay, good. All right, I'm going to see if there's anything on the second side here. Okay. I said to myself, man, he really speaks in a very formal, measured way. So I'm glad to know that he's reading from something. Otherwise, he's like brilliant. I mean, I'm sure he is brilliant anyway. But okay, let me just start this here. Yeah. Wow. All right, starting back up here. So I'll put you back on.
But all of us have times to use motivational terms, such as this, when others don't do what we think they should. And sometimes even when we do not do what we think we should. Yet it is neither accurate nor descriptive to say that someone does nothing at all. So with all motivational terms, they lose their descriptive value when one becomes intimate with what is going on in the world of another person. Thus our statewide travels brought us face to face with a strange paradox. The more we understood what was actually happening, the less useful was our lexicon of psychodynamic terms. So already we'd come a long ways in Freud, even further, perhaps, than we then suspected. But nonetheless, our next step was to be bolder than any we had yet taken. Now, what if a person thinks he is neurotic or even is neurotic? Does he have to act that way? Or continue to live that way? This is not a very well posed question, but it does with some such proposition as this in our minds that my students and I undertook a radical approach to psychotherapy. Radical, not altogether new. When the commitment undertaken without what from a neurotic position, without forced my safety net of rationalizations, and hence succeeding in making anything of ourselves at all. It occurred to us to therapy might be in getting the client to get on with a new way of life without waiting to acquire insight. After all, is not that the way man has been treating himself for thousands of years? Rarely does one know where he is going when he launches out into a new way of life, and even less often does he know what is wrong with the pathway he abandons. It is only when a thematically rationalized and elaborately psychologized insists on knowing where the whys before seeking to experience them. So, asking each client to write a self-characterization and to Q-sort the knowledge inventory cards containing self-descriptive statements. This was before the days of the Minnesota multiphasic inventory and before the thing we can call Q-sorting. Would take this information and write another sketch, as it might have been written by another person. Embodied in this sketch of ours would be a different outlook, and some illustrations of how such an outlook led to characteristic social behavior. The therapist would then take this sketch back to the client, ask him to pretend that he was the other person for perhaps 2 weeks, rehearse the part with him every day or two, and invite him to pay particular attention to the results of the experiment. There was, of course, a good deal more to it than play acting. We soon realized that there were tricks to writing the role, ways of setting up real-life situations, and particularly a framework for presenting the undertaking to a skeptical and usually reluctant client, who would ordinarily prefer to talk about himself. This is not the place to go into detail as to how this fixed role therapy, as we have come to call it, was carried out. Let me say only that it produced some exciting results. A little not I can come back to it and attempt to experience contributed to the theory that I'm pretending to talk about. Artist and not a scientist. But the scientist at his best is a man of action and empathy. It is conceded that the clinician might be regarded as an applied scientist himself, but most psychologists believe that the scientist and the two quite I've described enough of my experiences to make it clear that one's counter to what I have seen. Whatever may have made in shaking loose from the old notions and in developing novel hypotheses out of living experience with man in distress, this is science, I think. And as I hope soon to make clear, clinician emerged out of my thinking more or less in the manner of a scientist. Indeed, I suspect that the best scientist is one who approaches his subject intimately, as a clinician may be expected to approach it. And the best clinician is one who invites his client to join him in the controlled investigation of life. Nowhere, it seems to me, is this intrinsic relationship more basic than in psychology. And in no discipline stands to lose more by failing to recognize it. One of my tasks in the 1930s was to direct graduate studies leading to the master's degree. A typical afternoon, I found me talking to a graduate student at 1 o'clock. Directors have to do. Encouraging the student to pinpoint the issues, to observe, to become to make some to relate his data to his predictions, to control his experiments. So even that led to what? Cautiously and to revise his thinking in the light of experience. At 2 o'clock, I might have an appointment with a client. During this interview, they're helping the distressed person work out some solutions to his life problems. So what would I do? Why? I would try to get him to pinpoint the issues, to observe, to become the hypothesis, comes to relate outcomes to anticipations, to control so that he will know what led to what, and to revise his dogma of experience. Design some world-shaking experiment with consideration taking expedition. So try to get mindedly to become intimate with the problem, to form hypotheses, all the things that all had to do with like another client. Guess what? Hoping to design a completely new personality before venturing this first change in behavior, or plunging into some ill-considered acting out of escapade. And so forth. But this, of course, was not my hour for science, it was my hour for psychotherapy. And what I had done with that student back in the hour before, that was obviously not psychotherapy, that was science. I must say that this sort of thing went on for a long time before it ever occurred to me that I was really doing some sort of thing all afternoon long. It seems incredible now that it took me so long to realize this, but at the time it seemed so perfectly obvious that science and psychotherapy were different, even contrasting kinds of experience. Science was objective and cold, psychotherapy was subjective and warm. Science dealt with truth, but psychotherapy with human. As I said before, my life has been the obvious things that got me into trouble. Maybe man's greatest and noblest undertaking may be to transcend the obvious. And that is something I wish I knew how to do. And there was something else that was slowly dawning on me. I must tell you about that before attempting to distill something out of blunt fixed-role therapy and my afternoons with the obvious. Almost any textbook written before 1940, and indeed most of the textbooks in elementary psychology turned out in the decades since, made quite an issue out of psychology's view of science. Generally, psychologists have emphasized the point that science is characterized more by its methods than by its accumulated body of knowledge. This being so, they argue, psychology is really pretty scientific stuff, even though it does not have many solid facts to point to. In fact, psychologists, being pretty self-conscious about their methodology, may have a bit better claim to being scientists than a lot of physicists who spend their time making engineering hay out of a few classic. In order to make clear what they meant, the authors of these textbooks would describe the essentials of scientific method, which is, as we all know, the how the scientist behaves. This fellow, called the scientist, pinpoints the issues they said, intimate with the practically, he makes test runs who relate the data to predictions, experiments so that he knows what leads to what, just cautiously, and revises his thinking in the light of experimental outcomes. These are the operations that explain the behavior of a person who has achieved the status of a scientist. Now, all of this is very interesting, particularly because it represents a very coherent theory of personality, albeit one that is reserved for scientists only. But now, as the author of our textbook turns from his credentials to his contributions, he abandons this perceptive theory of personality and starts to tell us how ordinary human beings, which he usually prefers to call organisms rather than scientists, function. In doing so, with such theories, man says, responds to stimuli, learns what he is taught, is propelled by his motives, is in his culture, and is swept along with the tides of social change. Now that I look back on it, I can't understand how one could have failed to discuss immediately the contrast in personality theories espoused by the term psychologist, who uses to explain himself, and on the other, the various concoctions he uses to explain ordinary mortals. Yet few of my colleagues find this paradox amusing. They say, but of course the scientist. But I must also it was a long time before I myself became aware of this inconsistency, and perhaps if I had been not a psychologist, I wouldn't be aware of it even now. Well, it seems that it might prove interesting to be one of two things. Either apply to psychologists themselves, the psychology they designed to explain the behavior of ordinary mortals, or to apply to man the psychology they designed to explain themselves. Since there are a lot more mortals in this world than there are psychologists, for the time being at least, we might run into more possibilities if we tried the latter. If we do so, it may be said that our model of man is that of man the scientist, and our questions will resolve about the issue of whether man can be understood in this manner, both in the floodlight of history and in the dark of his closet. It has been only recently in my professional life that I have been willing to regard myself as either a philosopher or a theoretician of any measure whatsoever. A long time ago, however, I felt a fancy in that. I am quite prepared to concede that I may not be very much a reader, but at least nowadays, if someone describes me as a person I don't protest as vigorously as I might have 20 years ago. I once wrote a novel, The Psychology, which did not be popular with publishers. That published, as one publisher put it, because as teachers in the profession. What I really found most seriously were the handbook of clinical procedures. Chapter writing always boils down why something should be done, confronted with a growing realization of the psychological thinking there are techniques like that. After the mainstream of psychology had I drifted, and what was there about this outlook I had developed that was do extensive self-examination? Could I speak my position in a coherent fashion? And if I could, would the issue I faced was, could I still need it? Describe these meanderings and modes of human distress, as I now remember them, it may appear to my listener that there are some converging lines of thought. Take the last two things I've mentioned. The afternoon of interviews alternating between psychotherapy and advice to researchers, and the two kinds of personality theory each technical writer espoused. Both suggest that, in practice, the struggles of man and man, the scientist, were against the same obstacles, and that those obstacles were to be surmounted in what has proved over the centuries to be the human way. And as we look back on our iconoclastic adventures with role therapy, we can see these also as fitting into a personality theory that says, in effect, that the means by which man has, over the centuries, coped most successfully with his historical obstacles are in some general way the basic devices he can extend and improve in coping with his personal distress. Fixed role therapy is, according to this model, not a panacea, but an experiment. In fact, we have learned that if it is presented as a panacea, it fails its purpose. The client does not get on with the life process of finding out for himself. So the old panaceas tend to immobilize man at those moments when he has to be exploring his alternatives creatively. Important an authentic way to live, but that it invites him to try a new way, calculated and venturesome, and to appraise its outcomes. People really know he applies to any life that is approached. Not all the new things men try prove to be good. Nothing you've ever tried, and even the old way, which once might have been, will become oppressively stagnant. Get on with it. But perhaps I can digress for a moment, for this may be as good a place as any to make a formal statement. I find it amusing to call it that. With other things, learning is a construct I think psychologists should have better and imitate with their minds. But my colleagues are not likely to take up with my advice, or to substitute another word for the same overgeneralization, to memorize the night before final examinations. This learning can be stated very simply. If you have your pencils handy, get on with it. What it emphasizes is that learning is not so much a matter of aligning organisms with stimuli as it is, first of all, a human undertaking. My objection to the notion of learning is not that there is so little in the world worth getting on with, but that getting on with it is the essential feature of life itself. Man lives best when he commits himself to getting nothing less to a living creature. I guess someone has to answer that. What I was saying, it seems to me that simple definition of learning is properly about the same as the definition of Life, learning seems redundant when applied to a living creature. And so too are the objectives of therapy. For therapy is a way of helping man get on with it, to live wholeheartedly. However, if you prefer to call the whole thing learning, this use of the term, as long as its meaning is not now than life's basic enterprise by the textbook writers. The account is intended to describe the course of experiences as I now remember them, which led to the formulation of the I've called personal construct theory. There also that as these experiences, I to a philosophical position, for which I can think of no better term at the moment than constructive alternativism. The period clients in therapy could often make good use of my preposterous explanations when it was not necessary or even desirable to refute one proposition before investigating its alternatives. The old self will before inviting participants. Groping towards sure, no construct theory. I'm convinced that this is not the way personal construct theory came into being. Then, therefore, is tell you how this theory happened. Or more accurate to say that this is how, in retrospect, I think it happened. Written there, perhaps intention in this autobiographical account of a personal construct to present it to you logically or rationally, just now. That is, that would be an undertaking of quite a different character, and certainly not the sort of thing that can be tacked on to an account such as I've tried to present. It's enough to say, by way of conclusion, that personal construct theory emerges is a form of psychology in which certain terms vanish along with the ideas they represent. Terms like learning, conditioning, motivation, stimulus, response, reinforcement, emotion, feeling, affect, cognition, insight, resistance, the unconscious, stimulus generalization, psychodynamics, ego, id, superego, psychosomatics, and even many of the favorite methodologies of scientific psychology. Many of those vanish too. In addition, some well-known terms are completely redefined. Terms like hostility, aggression, guilt, anxiety, transference, identification, role, acceptance, dependency, validity, determinism, freedom, variable, construct, and even a night is done with our old friend truth. It's too bad there's no time to tell you what happened to all these venerable ideas known to have been popular back in the early 20th century. The end of it. And in case there are any surviving listeners, may I suggest that you may want to get up and stretch. This was dictated on February 1st, 1964, in case you're interested. And my name is George A. Kelly. In fact, that may have some relevance.
Sounds like maybe that was it. Okay. Yes.